Welcome back to the Chasing Happiness podcast, an honest podcast about finding happiness, what it really means, and the process of getting there. My name is Crystal, and today I'm going to talk to a wonderful lady named Carol. And Carol, it has taken us a long time to get to this conversation because, as we were just talking about a minute ago, life has been chaotic, things have been crazy. So we're going to talk about all of that. But before we do, you are a transformational life coach for women over the age of 50 who are ready to reconnect, rediscover, and reinvent, which I think is an amazing tagline. So do you want to introduce yourself to everyone who's listening who may not know who you are?
Yes, I would love to. Thank you, Crystal. Nice to finally get together with you. So, so I've been a physiotherapist for 36 years, actually. That's my background. And with a lot of that came a lot of neuroplasticity. And as it changed, I changed in the way I treated patients. But that wasn't the moment that I decided to do coaching, actually. 4 years ago, unfortunately, my second husband passed away. And he'd been ill for 6 years. And at the same time, I was working full time treating chronic pain patients. And I was flying to and from Canada to the UK with my mum being sick there. And I was looking after a friend who had Alzheimer's. I had to clean his house. I had to sell it. I had to put him into a home. And so when Brian died that first year, I could barely move. And I went back to work within a week after his funeral. Stupid, I know, but I did. And I was so depleted and so exhausted that about a year later, I sat there and thought, well, now what? Who am I without him? What's the point? And somebody said, well, what brings you joy? And it was like, oh, I don't know anymore. So that's where the change to coaching came for me. That's where it's like, oh, I need someone to help me because this is just hard to deal with. Grief is hard to deal with. And all of that is hard to deal with.
That's such an important thing that you bring up, because I think we, in the society that we live in right now, especially, we are always so consumed with taking care of the people in our lives, the family, the friends. And as we get older, of course, that becomes parents as well. Yes. And, raising your kids, and then they go off to college, but then you still have your spouse. And when you get to the point where you literally have become a different person through that whole process, and you no longer have a connection with your inner self.
That is exactly. And I don't think we realize, and unfortunately, until sometimes a big episode happens. And as women, and certainly my generation, I'm in my 50s, you were brought up to be nice, to be polite, to do as you were told, to not really speak up, and really you should help everybody else. And we sort of took that on as, well, that's how it is. And, physiotherapy is a helping profession, and I absolutely loved it, but it's a helping profession. Certainly with people with chronic pain, it can be pretty heavy because they have a lot of issues. And then I have children, so you're a mom and a wife, and, the layers of shoulds and have-tos just keep going, and you lose yourself. You become this kind of shallow shell of who am I? Because I've pushed down what I want to do. I've pushed my needs down because I need to take the kids to soccer, or I need to run somebody to the hospital, or whatever it is, or I need to work late. I mean, it doesn't have to be that you're a parent. Maybe you have a job which is very demanding, and you give and you give and you give until you've got nothing left. That's where I was. I had nothing left.
And I think there's a lot of women, especially, who are in similar circumstances when you get to be that age, right? I know I have friends who their kids have just left for college, and you go through this transformational sort of moment of, well, now without that aspect of my life, who am I? What do I want to be? Because there is still so much life in front of you. It's not like, we retire at 62 and then life is over. It's not how it works.
That's exactly. And, it's really funny you should say that, Crystal, because when I was sitting there this year later, still in grief, of course, but a little bit able to think. And I thought, well, I'm way too young and I've got way too much life left to live. My mum lived till she was 92. I had at least 35 more years. It's like, well, Carol, you have a choice now. And that doesn't mean it was easy, and it doesn't mean I wasn't grieving. And I think that's really important, because people may think, well, she's a little bit hard. No, not at all. In fact, I only just stopped seeing a grief counselor, and we're at 4 years. So there we go. It's a profound thing, but the person that has to make the choice, we can't chase happiness from the outside. And it was really learning that. It's like, wow, I have to take self-responsibility for whatever's coming next.
That's so huge. And you bring up a really good point, because I think a lot of times people, especially because we live in this society that sort of like, get through what you're going through, move on, get through it as quick as you can kind of thing, and get on to the next thing, because, you know, another shoe is going to drop somewhere along the way. You are always processing grief and trauma and everything that you're going through. It's not like you wake up one morning and suddenly you're over it. You know, 4 years for you seeing a counselor, a grief counselor, you're still dealing with that over and over and over again. And it's really important that we recognize that, because I don't want anyone listening to think, oh, well, after a certain amount of time, I should be over something. It doesn't work that way.
It really doesn't. And what was interesting to me about having to live through grief and with grief is that if you haven't experienced it, you may be empathetic to a friend or a loved one who's lost someone, and you think you understand, and you're like, yeah. And then you experience it, and it's like, oh my gosh, I had no clue it was like this. And even though it was expected, even though I knew it was happening, even though we had prepared everything, and he actually said to me, oh, you'll be fine in a couple of months, Carol. I'm like, oh, I didn't think so, but okay. I couldn't believe the effect, you know, whether you're watching TV and somebody dies and it brings it back. And of course, it could be the grief trauma, but it could be trauma for people who've had abuse of some kind. He was a jazz musician, so music. Oh my gosh, I love music. I love his music. I can't bear to listen to it, because it just touches my soul so deeply. And it is that we shared together that is no longer. And so almost trying to rediscover what it is I love, and to create that new life with him in my heart, but not being, not living as a widow, I think.
That's
and choosing something else. Yeah.
And I think that's one of the important things, is the choosing sort of what comes next. So for people who are listening, and maybe they were in a similar situation to you, maybe they're just sort of at that stage where they're like, I have no idea what I like anymore. How did you start to figure it out?
I hired coaches was the first thing. I did courses. I'm a great reader. I got so many books, a lot on happiness, I have to say, because you know, you start Googling, what's my life purpose? What's the point? And for me, actually, the point was always my children. I'd look at the pictures and go, they're my point. They're adults, but I love them and they bring me joy. But it's starting to look inside and see, well, you know, what's important to me? And that's going to be different for everyone. And I think a lot of women have never sat down and thought about that, because they're looking after everybody else, and you know, and it's loving and kind. And I say now I'm a reformed self-sacrificer, almost, because it's a work in progress, right?
Sure.
If you are a people pleaser, if you're a giver, and we have to look back, well, how did that develop? Why are we people pleasers? And so we need to look at that. We need to look at our roles. We need to look at limiting beliefs. Oh, I'm too old. No, you're not. Oh, it's too hard. It's hard, but it's not too hard if you want something different. And learning to step out of the comfort zone is much easier when you have support. It's hard to do by yourself. It really is. Even with all those self-help books that we all have, even with all the courses we've all sort of bought for, you know, $1.99 and then done the first module and left, or downloaded the freebie. I bet we've all got all those freebies on our computer that we haven't looked at, because it's not keeping you accountable. And that self-responsibility can be hard, especially when you're going through a difficult time. I'm not sure if I answered your question.
You absolutely did. And I love the answer because I think the point that you're making is so vitally important, especially after the last couple of years that we've been through. You and I were talking briefly before we started recording about how it seems like we're kind of getting back to normal after COVID, although we know we're not quite normal because COVID's not over yet. And I think everyone who I talk to, whether they be clients of mine, whether they be friends, family, everyone who I interact with says, I feel like I've kind of, in some ways, especially over the last couple of years, been going through this life struggle alone because we haven't been able to hang out with our friends as much. For those of us in Canada, we've experienced some pretty severe lockdowns. We have not had support systems in the way that we as human beings need support systems. So having someone to essentially hold your hand or just be there to listen when you need it is so vitally important.
It really is. And it sort of takes me back to the very first year, I think it was 2020, when we were in the pandemic. And we were still treating. We'd shut down the clinic and then we went back. And, we're all masked and gowned and everybody clean. And patients would come in and they'd say, you're my only friend, the only person I can see. And of course, as a physiotherapist and the sort of stuff we were doing, we put our hands on people. And it was the only touch that they'd had. And it was profound. It was, a privilege to be able to offer that to people and to listen and to hold space for them. But other people don't have that. They don't have anybody. And Zoom is wonderful. We can connect, but it's not the same as a hug.
Yes.
It's not the same as somebody putting their hand on your hand or your shoulder. And it's that connection that we need, isn't it?
100%.
When you're struggling, whether it's because you're an empty nester, I mean, some people struggle with that so badly because their role was a mum and now it's gone and now what? Or maybe they're divorced. Maybe they've never lived alone. Maybe it's, lost a spouse. Maybe it's the loss of a job. It can be so many things that actually put us into grief.
Yeah.
Grief doesn't always have to be about losing a loved one. It can be from many things. And we need to support people and understand that their journey, everybody's journey is so different.
Yes.
So different. At 6 months, I remember a friend, somebody who I thought was quite in tune with sensibilities, said, "So are you over your grief yet?" I'm like, no.
Wow.
And even somebody else said to me, "Well, 4 years, Carol." And I said, "I know, I can't even begin to explain why that is, but that's how it is. That's how it is. I guess I really loved him a lot," which of course I did. And it's almost like you have to deal with it just a little bit at a time, and you just move one small step at a time towards where you want to go. And it's that discovery, that transformational journey of, where do I want to go? What do I want to do? And that's the exciting part for me, is helping women to discover that.
I love that. So for people who are listening, who want to get in touch with you, who have questions because they're going through the same thing, what is the best way for them to get in touch with you?
The best way is through my website. There's a contact me form there. It's www.carolbanens.com, and I will answer your emails. And there's no obligation, just chat. And if I can help you, I'd love to. But, be open and just contact me. I'd love to speak to you.
Perfect. And for everyone who is listening, I, of course, will put in the show notes a link to the website as well as the social media and everything else so that you can get in touch. But Carol, I wonder, because I'm just in my early 40s, but I'm starting to experience some of the things you're referring to. My parents are getting older. Yeah. I don't personally have kids, but everyone I know has kids. And I have different people in my life who are at different stages. Some of them are going through divorces. Some of them are sending kids off to college for the first time. One of my most amazing friends has sent his oldest daughter off to college, literally just within the last couple of weeks. And watching him struggle, because it's such an emotional experience. She has decided to go out of state, which is a big deal as well. It's the first time she's sort of leaving home, and, it's his little girl, and there's this whole thing. And so I wonder for everyone who sort of is in that place who's listening right now, and they're thinking, I know I should have it together because this is the society we live in. It says I should have it all together. What's the one thing, because you've been through this, what's the one thing you would suggest to them to sort of let go of everybody's expectations and just focus on themselves?
I would say you don't have to have it all together. I would say you have to honor the feelings, and acceptance is a really challenging thing sometimes when it's something you don't like. So accept that you're feeling sad, accept that you're frightened for your daughter leaving home. I know about that. My daughter did her first year of university in England and left at 16. It was unbearable to watch her at the airport. And yet it was the best thing for her. So I think we have to really be aware of how we're feeling and honor them, accept them, and not shove them down. Because when you shove them down, and I did that with my grief, to be honest, it comes back to bite you in the bum, first of all, but also when you try and negate a certain emotion, it doesn't just stop you feeling that one, it stops you feeling the others. So no wonder I felt flat and joyless, because I was trying to push down the grief, rather than experience it, and just sit with it and be with it. Sometimes we have to do that difficult stuff to allow it to process, to allow ourselves to go, okay, I love that person so much. Of course, I feel grief, and that is okay. Not shouldn't be feeling it, should be over it now.
Right.
I think acceptance of where you're at is a really important thing. Breathing and speaking kindly to yourself.
Ooh.
Speak kindly to yourself, not I should be over it, I'm so stupid, everybody else looks okay. And actually, I would say that's another thing. They might look okay, but they may be dying inside. I know that's how I felt. You look like you're doing really well. Actually, no, I'm not. But so I think, accepting that emotion, sitting with it, breathing with it, and being kind to yourself.
I think being kind to yourself is such a great piece of advice, because often we experience the world in a way that tells us we should X, Y, or Z, even when we're not feeling whatever the X, Y, or Z happens to be. And we get into this habit, from a very young age of, well, I should this, I should that, rather than saying, you know what, it's okay that I'm not that today. Maybe I will be tomorrow. Maybe I'll be a little bit better tomorrow. Maybe I won't, maybe today's a day I get out of my pajamas. Maybe it's not, whatever it happens to be. And just being okay with sort of that flow of whatever you're going through.
I think so. And I think it's something we have to practice, because it isn't something we've done, right? We have to go to work. We should do this. I mean, who goes to work 3 days after their husband's funeral, really, for goodness sakes? But, didn't do me any good, really. It really didn't. And so whatever emotion it is, even if it's, if it's sadness, sit with it. Why are you sad? But, and here's the but I would say, is we can sit in sadness and grief that moment, maybe for 10 minutes, 15 minutes, maybe the day, but we don't want a lifetime of it.
Right.
And I think we have to look at the ebb and flow. Some days are going to be better, some days aren't. I can remember thinking, wow, I'm better, I feel good. Crash the next day. And then I'd have a week when I felt better, and I think, oh, I must be over it now. Silly me. But so it comes and it goes, and I think we do need to do that flow with it a little bit. It doesn't mean, sitting in it and being a victim. That's not what I mean. I mean just accepting that an emotion is okay to feel, but don't get stuck down there for the next 30 years.
Yes. Oh, such a great piece of advice for everyone listening. I do want to be respectful of your time, and I typically ask a couple of questions of the people who come on the podcast at the end. Are you game to answer? I promise they're not difficult.
Okay.
So the first question is, if you could go back and give yourself a piece of advice, what would it be?
Ooh. I think it would be have more fun. I think it would be Yes, because I was brought up in a very, educational my environment. Education's important. You've got to learn, you've got to go to school and do the right thing. And whilst all that is very good, there wasn't a lot of fun.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say, learn to find things that make you smile more and understand about gratitude earlier. I think that would be another one, because that really changes everything.
That's huge. I love that. Okay, the next question is, if you could have a conversation with anyone in the world, living or dead, who would it be and why?
So many people. And of course, I'm going to say my husband, Brian, because the interesting thing is when somebody is no longer there with you, you'll hear something and you'll say, oh, he was so smart, he told me that, or oh, he told me that. And I would just love to have a conversation with him about how I miss him, but how losing him pushed me to get out of my comfort zone and do something different.
Wow, what an amazing conversation that would be.
I think so.
Wow, I love that answer. Thank you for that. I love asking people that question specifically because oftentimes as they're answering, I will start to think about, like, in my life, how does that person relate to my circumstance kind of thing? And what would I ask them? And it's so interesting because we've talked a little bit about grief. And, there have been times when I've asked that question to someone. And the first thought I had was, to have a conversation with my grandfather who died, 7 days after my 11th birthday. The things I would ask him as an adult versus, when I was 11, the things that I had asked him, right? So you start to think about, well, who are those people in my life who I didn't have the conversation that I would love to have now? Or who are those people that I can still have those conversations with before that time comes, kind of thing. So thank you for answering that.
Yes, you're welcome.
The next question is, what inspires you?
Again, so many things. I would say, coming from the world of physiotherapy, often my patients would inspire me. And I'm thinking of one, I'm still doing some, who takes everything I say and runs with it, no matter how wacky. And I'm getting a little bit more out there with my information for her about reading Joe Dispenza and all the visualizations. She is going with it and she inspires me. I absolutely love treating this lady because she's open and she goes with it. And even though she's in really awful pain, she really, really just does it all to try and get better. So she would be one. But what also inspires me is music, nature. I was at a friend's party and somebody's little 1-year-old baby was there. And I love that. I love babies, my children, my friends. Oh, so much, so much.
I love that. And I love that you brought up multiple things because I think we sometimes forget we can find inspiration in multiple places in multiple ways. We think, I can only be inspired by other people. But, I was inspired this morning when I went and watered the garden because there was bees outside. Like, you can find it everywhere.
The little things, right? The colors of the flowers, the scent as you walk past a lilac bush. I don't know. All of these things. There's so much.
Oh, I love that answer.
That is where the lesson of gratitude comes in, because as you start to really be grateful and appreciate, you start to be more inspired.
That's so true. And then you find more things to be grateful for and more things that inspire you. And it totally changes the journey.
It does. It really does. Yeah.
I love that. Okay. The last question is, what does happiness mean to you?
Happiness means not relying on something outside of myself anymore. This is new in the last few years for me as I've explored it more, but I think that inner contentment, that inner gratitude for life, for whatever is around me, for being able to find blessings in the most difficult situations. I had water pouring through my roof the other day in the basement, and I thought, what are my blessings? That my contractor came within an hour and sorted it out. So,
wow.
Happiness, I was pretty happy with that. But I think that internal joy and happiness, again, stemming from gratitude, but always, what makes me happy? My children, nature, the chipmunks in the garden, all of these things make me happy. But I think also contribution, when you can help others, is a big, big deal for feeling good and feeling fulfilled, which makes you feel happy, joyful. Happiness we tend to think of as a bit transitory. But if you can feel that joy inside, that just feeling good. Dr. Rick Hansen says about taking in the good, whether you are smelling a flower, rather than going, oh, that's a lovely flower. Look at the colors, feel the petals, really absorb it. And as you do that, that makes you feel good. So learning to do that with all the little things, I think that's what makes me happy.
Oh, what a wonderful answer. Oh, you're amazing.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you so much for joining me today. I think this has been a timely conversation, because as I get older, more and more people I know are getting to that stage of life where they're starting to experience that, like, what do I do now? What comes after this? Right. And I think especially because of the last few years that we've had, a lot of people are really starting to look at their lives just in general and say, like, what works for me and what doesn't? And how do I make a life that's meaningful to myself? So this has been wonderful.
Oh, you're so welcome. And I've sort of expanded it to midlife women, because which could be anything from 35 to 70, right? Now that we live older. So it's not just for women over 50. So if you are somewhere struggling with any of those things, then I would love to chat to you. And it's wonderful.
Been great. And I will, of course, as I mentioned, post in the show notes a link, not just to the website, but to all the social media, so that you can get in touch with Carol. If you've been listening to this conversation and you want to reach out, even just to say, hey, Carol, you were wonderful. The podcast was great. I'm sure she would appreciate that. So Carol, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It was great, Crystal.
Thank you. And thank you all for listening. If you found this conversation helpful, or you know someone who you might think could find it helpful or is going through something and maybe just needs to hear the message, please feel free to share it with them as well. I hope you guys have an amazing week. Thank you for coming back to listen week after week. 7 years into this podcast, I can't believe I still get to do this every week. So thank you so much. Have a wonderful week. We will chat with you next week. Bye for now.